Imagine losing someone you love, but instead of vanishing, they were taken by a cursed creature lurking in the shadows. This is not just a legend. This is a dark secret buried for centuries, and the truth, it will haunt you forever. Some mysteries remain buried in the shadows whispers of the past. Unresolved crimes, secrets locked away in silence. But sometimes on the right night, in the right company, those mysteries resurface, demanding to be told. Raymond West exhaled a slow, deliberate cloud of smoke, watching as it curled and twisted in the dimly lit room. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the armrest, then repeated the words, savoring them like an actor delivering his finest line. Unsolved mysteries. His voice held a self-conscious pleasure, relishing the drama of the phrase. The room was steeped in history, the kind of space where shadows stretched long and stories whispered through the walls. Broad black beams crisscrossed the ceiling, and the furniture, aged yet dignified, seemed to belong to the very bones of the house. A fire crackled in the hearth, throwing flickering patterns against the dark wooden panels, as if the very air around them were alive with unspoken secrets. Raymond's gaze traveled across the room, lingering with approval. As a writer, atmosphere mattered to him. It had to be just right, and his Aunt Jane's house never failed to deliver. It was a place where mystery felt at home. His eyes came to rest on the figure seated by the fire, Miss Jane Marple. She sat upright in the great-grandfather chair, her back straight, her expression serene yet ever watchful. She wore a black brocade dress, pinched in tight at the waist, with delicate Metland lace cascading down the bodice. Black lace mittens covered her hands, which moved with practiced ease as she knitted something soft, white, and fleecy. Her snow-white hair was arranged in careful piles beneath a black lace cap, and her faded blue eyes, benign yet shrewd, swept the room with quiet amusement. She observed them all with the gentle pleasure of a woman who had seen much, understood more, and yet chose to keep her thoughts to herself until the moment was right. The assembled company was a study in contrasts. Joyce Lempriere, the sharp-eyed artist, sat with an air of effortless poise, her jet-black cropped hair stark against her pale skin, her hazel-green eyes glinting with mischief. Beside her, Sir Henry Clithering, a man who carried the quiet authority of experience, studied the fire with a half-smile playing at his lips. He was well-groomed, impeccably dressed, and most importantly had seen the underbelly of crime more intimately than he would ever admit. In the far corner, near the bookshelves, Dr. Pender, the elderly clergyman, sat deep in thought, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Next to him, perched on the edge of his seat, was Mr. Petherick, the solicitor, a dried-up little man whose sharp eyes peered over his glasses rather than through them, as if he distrusted even his own sight. The silence was broken by Petherick's signature dry cough, a subtle warning that he was about to speak. Unsolved mysteries, you say? He tilted his head slightly. Ha! And what exactly do you mean by that, Mr. West? Before Raymond could answer, Joyce smirked, her voice laced with amusement. Oh, don't encourage him, Mr. Petherick. Raymond just likes the way it sounds, and the way he sounds saying it. Raymond threw her a look of mock offense, but Joyce only laughed, her sharp, knowing gaze challenging him to object. He's a humbug, isn't he, Miss Marple? She teased. Miss Marple's hands never faltered in their knitting, but her lips curved into a small, knowing smile. She did not answer, but her silence spoke volumes. Life itself is an unsolved mystery, Dr. Pender intoned gravely. Raymond sat forward suddenly, flicking the end of his cigarette into the fire. His voice, when he spoke, carried a touch of impatience. That's not what I mean, Doctor. I'm talking about real mysteries, things that have happened but have never been explained. Crimes that remain unsolved, secrets lost to time. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, but instead of acknowledging his point, she tilted her head slightly and said, in that mild, unassuming voice of hers, "Well, dear, Mrs. Kershaw had the oddest experience just yesterday morning. She bought 2 gills of picked shrimps from Elliott's, but by the time she got home, they had vanished into thin air. She retraced her steps, but no one had seen them. They simply disappeared." A silence fell over the room. Then, with perfect gravity, Sir Henry murmured, "A very fishy story indeed." A ripple of laughter broke the tension, but Miss Marple remained undeterred, her cheeks turning ever so slightly pink with excitement. "There are, of course, any number of explanations," she continued. "For instance, somebody else might have." Raymond groaned, shaking his head with a grin. "My dear Aunt Jane, I wasn't referring to village oddities. I meant murders. The kind of cases Sir Henry could tell us about for hours." Sir Henry Clithering smiled, that subtle, knowing expression returning. "But I never talk shop." "No, of course not," Joyce interjected dryly. "And yet, here we are." A shift in the air, a change in the tone. The moment turned. What had started as playful banter now carried weight. Sir Henry leaned forward slightly. "I suppose," he admitted, "there are a fair number of cases that never do get solved." Raymond gazed into the fire, its embers glowing like secrets long buried. "I wonder," he murmured, "just how many mysteries have been left to die in the dark." The wind howled against the window panes. The night had truly begun. "There are things that vanish without a trace," whispers, lost in the wind, footsteps erased by time, crimes buried so deep they may never be unearthed. Some call it fate, others mere coincidence. But I believe. Raymond West exhaled a slow stream of smoke, his voice deliberate. "I believe in unsolved mysteries." Joyce Lempriere, ever sharp and amused, leaned back in her chair and smirked. "Nothing about them, really," she said lightly, her hazel, green eyes glinting with mischief. "Raymond just likes the sound of the words, and the sound of himself saying them." Raymond shot her a glance of mock reproach, but Joyce only laughed, tilting her head back, her dark hair catching the flickering firelight. "He's a humbug, isn't he, Miss Marple?" she teased, turning to the elderly woman seated by the fire. "You must know that." Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, merely smiled a small, knowing smile that held no judgment, only quiet amusement. She said nothing, but her silence itself was an answer. Across the room, Dr. Pender, the elderly clergyman, folded his hands and spoke in a voice tinged with thoughtful gravity. "Life itself is an unsolved mystery." Raymond, as if suddenly restless, sat up straight and flicked the remainder of his cigarette into the fire with an impatient gesture. "That's not what I mean," he said quickly. "I'm not talking about philosophy or fate or the great unknown. I mean real, tangible things, strange, inexplicable events, crimes that go unanswered, disappearances that are never explained." Miss Marple's soft blue eyes twinkled as she nodded, as if she understood exactly what he meant. "Oh yes, dear, I know just the sort of thing. Why, only yesterday Mrs. Kershaw had the oddest experience. She bought 2 gills of picked shrimps from Elliott's, went to 2 other shops, and when she got home, Miss Marple paused meaningfully, her expression slightly flushed with the thrill of the tale. The shrimps were gone. Simply vanished. A brief silence followed. Then Sir Henry Clithering, a man who had spent years untangling the darkest threads of human nature, leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "A very fishy story indeed," he murmured dryly. A chuckle rippled through the room, but Miss Marple, undeterred, continued with bright-eyed enthusiasm. "Now, of course, there are all sorts of possible explanations," she began, her cheeks growing pinker with excitement. Raymond groaned, though he was smiling. "My dear Aunt Jane, I wasn't referring to misplaced groceries. I meant real mysteries, murders, disappearances, things Sir Henry could tell us about for hours if he chose to." Sir Henry, his face unreadable, gave a modest shrug. "Ah, but I never talk shop." Joyce scoffed playfully. "No, of course not," she said, arching an eyebrow. "And yet, here we are." Something shifted in the air. A moment ago this had been idle chatter, a parlor game played by intellectuals over brandy and firelight. But now, a hush settled over them, as if the weight of something unseen had entered the room. Sir Henry tapped a finger against the arm of his chair, considering. "I suppose," he admitted slowly, "there are quite a few cases that never do get solved." Raymond's gaze drifted toward the fire, watching the embers glow and crackle like secrets too dangerous to be spoken aloud. His voice was quieter now, more thoughtful. "I wonder," he murmured, almost to himself, "just how many mysteries have been left to die in the dark." Outside, the wind howled against the window panes, rattling them as though it, too, carried a secret longing to be heard. And inside, for just a moment, the small gathering of minds sat together in the flickering firelight, considering all the things in the world that had disappeared, never to be found again. What kind of mind truly excels at solving a mystery? Raymond West posed the question, his voice thoughtful as he leaned back in his chair. The fire crackled, its warm glow casting flickering shadows across the room. "One always feels," he continued, "that the average police detective must be limited by a lack of imagination." Sir Henry Clithering, ever composed, raised an eyebrow and replied dryly, "That is the layman's point of view." Joyce Lempriere, sharp-witted as ever, tilted her head, a mischievous smile playing on her lips. "What you really need, then, is a committee," she said teasingly. After all, psychology and imagination belong to the writer. With a flourish, she made a mock bow in Raymond's direction. But Raymond, unusually serious, barely acknowledged the jest. "The art of writing gives one an insight into human nature," he said, his voice grave. "A writer sees motives where the ordinary person might see nothing at all." Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking steadily, regarded her nephew with gentle amusement. "I know, dear, that your books are very clever," she said in her soft, unassuming way. "But do you truly think people are as unpleasant as you make them out to be?" Raymond chuckled. "My dear aunt," he said, his tone indulgent, "hold on to your beliefs. Heaven forbid that I should shatter them." Miss Marple, however, was not so easily dismissed. She pursed her lips, counting stitches as she spoke. "It's just that, in my experience, so many people are neither particularly good nor particularly bad, but simply, well, very silly." Mr. Petherick, the dry and precise solicitor, gave a small, deliberate cough, the kind that prefaced a statement of undeniable logic. "Don't you think, Raymond," he said, adjusting his glasses, "that you place too much weight on imagination? Imagination is a dangerous thing, as we lawyers know all too well. The only way to truly sift through evidence is to examine the facts, nothing more, nothing less. That is the only logical method for arriving at the truth." He paused, then added with quiet finality, "And in my experience, it is the only one that succeeds." Joyce let out a short, incredulous laugh and tossed back her dark head. "Nonsense," she declared. "I bet I could outmatch all of you in solving a mystery. You men talk of facts and logic, but I have something you don't. I am a woman." She placed a hand dramatically over her heart. "And say what you will, women have an intuition that is simply denied to men." Her gaze flickered to Miss Marple, who smiled but said nothing. Joyce pressed on. "And beyond that, I am an artist. I see things that the rest of you overlook. Shapes, colors, expressions, the subtle details that reveal the truth. I've moved in circles you wouldn't dream of, met people from all walks of life. I know life in a way that, say, darling Miss Marple here, simply cannot possibly understand." A pause followed. Miss Marple, ever unruffled, continued to knit, her fingers deft and unhurried. Then, without looking up, she said mildly, "Oh, I don't know about that, my dear." Something in her tone, calm, assured, and just the slightest bit amused, made Joyce falter for half a second. Sir Henry gave a small, knowing smile. Raymond glanced at his aunt with a flicker of curiosity. And in that moment, it became apparent to all that beneath her lace mittens and quiet demeanor, Miss Marple was more than she seemed. Miss Marple's voice, though gentle, carried a quiet weight as she spoke. "My dear, very painful and distressing things happen in villages sometimes." Her pale blue eyes, bright with a lifetime of quiet observation, rested thoughtfully on the group. There was a Pausian, almost imperceptible shift in the air, as if she had subtly reminded them all that mysteries were not the sole property of bustling cities and grand scandals. Then Dr. Pender cleared his throat, his smile warm yet knowing. "May I speak?" he asked. "It is quite fashionable nowadays to dismiss the clergy, I know. But you see, we hear things. We bear witness to the hidden side of human nature, the side that is a sealed book to the outside world. His words carried a quiet conviction, and for a moment there was a thoughtful silence. It was Joyce Lempriere, ever lively, who broke it. She leaned forward, eyes gleaming with sudden inspiration. "It seems to me that we are a rather representative little gathering. How about we form a club?" She glanced around, gauging the reactions. "Today is Tuesday, isn't it? Let's call it the Tuesday Night Club. We'll meet every week, and each time one of us must present a mysteria case we have personal knowledge of, and of course, know the answer to. The rest must try to solve it." There was a murmur of interest, a ripple of approval. Joyce quickly counted aloud. "Let me see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We ought really to be 6. "You have forgotten me, dear," Miss Marple interjected cheerfully. Her serene smile was unwavering. Joyce hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. She had not expected Miss Marple to want to participate. But she recovered swiftly. "That would be lovely, Miss Marple," she said, adjusting her tone to be bright and welcoming. "I just didn't think you'd care to play." Miss Marple's smile deepened, her knitting needles clicking steadily. "I think it would be very interesting," she said demurely, "especially with so many clever gentlemen present. I'm afraid I am not very clever myself, but living all these years in St. Mary Mead does give one a certain insight into human nature." Sir Henry Clithering, ever the gentleman, inclined his head. "I am sure your contribution will be invaluable, Miss Marple." His voice was courteous, yet there was something in his expression, perhaps the faintest glimmer of curiosity. "Who's going to start?" Joyce asked eagerly. Dr. Pender glanced toward Sir Henry and smiled. "I think there can be no doubt about that." All eyes turned toward the former Scotland Yard Commissioner. Sir Henry remained silent for a moment, his gaze drifting to the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on his distinguished face. He sighed, slowly recrossed his legs, and finally spoke. "It is a little difficult for me to select just the right case for you," he admitted, "but as it happens, I do know of an instancia case that fits the conditions perfectly." His voice lowered slightly, drawing them in. The room seemed to still, the warm glow of the lamps casting a hushed anticipation over the gathering. The Tuesday Night Club had begun. Sir Henry Clithering leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but laced with intrigue. "You may have seen some mention of the case in the papers about a year ago. At the time, it was dismissed as an unsolved mystery, but as fate would have it, the solution came into my hands not many days ago." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the group. The fire crackled in the silence. "The facts, at first glance, are quite simple. 3 people sat down to supper amongst other things. They ate tinned lobster. Later that night, all 3 fell gravely ill. A doctor was hastily summoned, but only 2 recovered. The 3rd person died." A small appreciative murmur ran through the room. Raymond West exhaled sharply. His writer's instincts instantly piqued. "Ah," he murmured, nodding. "As I said," continued Sir Henry, "the facts appeared straightforward. The death was attributed to food poisoning. A medical certificate was issued accordingly, and the deceased was buried. Case closed. But," he let the word hang for effect, "things did not rest there." Miss Marple nodded knowingly, her knitting needles clicking softly. "There was talk, I suppose," she remarked. "There usually is." Sir Henry allowed himself a faint smile. "Indeed, and with good reason. Now, let me introduce the key players in this little drama. For the sake of discretion, we shall call them Mr. and Mrs. Jones, and the wife's companion, Miss Clark." He leaned back, folding his hands together. Mr. Jones was a commercial traveler for a firm of manufacturing chemists. A good-looking man, though in a rather coarse, florid way, around 50 years old. His wife, Mrs. Jones, was an unremarkable woman of about 45. And then there was Miss Clark, the wife's companion. She was a stout, cheerful woman, always beaming, with a round, ruddy face. None of them, at first glance, particularly interesting. But then, his voice dropped slightly, pulling his audience in. The trouble began in the most peculiar way. You see, the night before Mrs. Jones's untimely demise, her husband had been staying at a small commercial hotel in Birmingham. Now this hotel had a rather diligent chambermaid, one with a habit of amusing herself in peculiar ways. Joyce Lempriere tilted her head. How so? Sir Henry allowed himself a small, knowing smile. The blotting paper in the writing desk had been replaced with fresh sheets that very day. And this chambermaid, having apparently little else to do, found herself studying the mirror image of what had been written upon it, just after Mr. Jones had used it to blot his letter. There was a ripple of interest. Dr. Pender leaned forward slightly, adjusting his glasses. And what, pray, did she see? Sir Henry did not answer at once. Instead, he let the moment stretch, the anticipation building. A few days later, he continued smoothly. A report appeared in the newspapers the tragic death of Mrs. Jones, attributed to food poisoning from tinned lobster. And it was only then that the chambermaid chose to share what she had seen, what had been left imprinted upon the blotting paper. The room was utterly still. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the wind stirred the night. Miss Marple glanced up briefly from her knitting. "Well now," she murmured, "that is interesting." Sir Henry Clithering leaned forward, his voice measured, his words deliberate. The words that the chambermaid had deciphered from the blotting paper were as follows. He paused, then spoke slowly, each word carrying a weight of ominous significance. "Entirely dependent on my wife." A hush settled over the room. The fire flickered, casting shadows on the walls. "When she is dead, I will." A sharp intake of breath from Joyce. ... Hundreds and thousands. The silence that followed was thick, charged with unspoken meaning. It didn't take much to fire the imagination of the chambermaids. Sir Henry continued. The implication seemed clear. Mr. Jones had planned to rid himself of his wife, expecting to inherit a fortune. Joyce exhaled sharply, her eyes gleaming with intrigue. "My word," she murmured. "As it happened," Sir Henry went on, "one of these maids had relatives living in the very town where the Joneses resided. She wrote to them, and they in turn wrote back with something quite startling. Mr. Jones, it seemed, had been very attentive to the local doctor's daughter, a striking young woman of 33. A knowing look passed between the listeners. And so, the whispers began. Scandal buzzed through the town. The Home Secretary was petitioned. Letters, numerous and ominous, poured into Scotland Yard, all accusing Mr. Jones of murdering his wife. Sir Henry sighed, steepling his fingers. Now, I must say that at first we dismissed it as nothing more than idle village gossip. We had no reason to suspect foul play. But public outcry can be relentless, and so, to put matters to rest, an exhumation order was granted. He leaned back, his voice dropping. It was one of those peculiar cases where baseless superstition, against all odds, proved to be shockingly justified. A flicker of excitement crossed Raymond's face. Miss Marple continued knitting, her expression unreadable. As a result of the autopsy, Sir Henry revealed, enough arsenic was found in the deceased's body to leave no doubt Mrs. Jones had died of deliberate poisoning. A murmur of shock rippled through the group. And so, he continued, it fell to Scotland Yard, working alongside the local authorities, to determine two things: how the arsenic had been administered, and by whom. Joyce leaned forward, her voice tinged with delight. "Oh, I like this," she declared. "This is the real stuff." Sir Henry gave a small, wry smile. Naturally, suspicion fell upon the husband. He stood to benefit from his wife's death not by the hundreds of thousands that the chambermaid had so romantically envisioned, but by a very solid sum of £8,000, not an insignificant amount. Raymond gave a low whistle. Mr. Jones, you see, had no independent wealth. He lived off his earnings, which were respectable but not extravagant. Yet he had a taste for expensive things, a fondness for luxury, and, more notably, a certain partiality for the company of women. The room was silent, every ear attuned, every mind working. Sir Henry allowed the moment to linger before continuing. "The question remained," he said, his voice steady. "How had it been done?" Sir Henry continued, his voice steady, the weight of the mystery thickening in the air. "We investigated, as delicately as possible, the rumors of Mr. Jones's supposed attachment to the doctor's daughter. While it was true that they had once shared a strong friendship, something curious had happened. Their relationship had come to an abrupt and unexplained end 2 months prior. Since then, they hadn't been seen together. Raymond leaned forward, intrigued. A sudden break. That's interesting. The doctor himself, Sir Henry went on, was an elderly man, straightforward, unsuspicious, the kind of person one would never imagine involved in scandal. When he learned the results of the autopsy, he was utterly dumbfounded. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. And what did he have to say about the night of the incident? He had been called to the house around midnight, Sir Henry explained, to find all 3 people suffering violently. He recognized at once that Mrs. Jones was in the worst condition and immediately sent back to his dispensary for some opium pills to ease her pain. But despite his best efforts, she succumbed before morning. And yet, not for a moment did he suspect foul play. He was convinced her death had been caused by botulism. A chill seemed to settle over the group. Supper that night had consisted of tinned lobster, salad, trifle, bread, and cheese. Unfortunately, none of the lobster remained. It had all been eaten, and the tin had already been discarded. "Convenient," murmured Joyce. The young maid, Gladys Lynch, was interrogated. She was terribly upsetterful, agitated, and difficult to keep on track. But she insisted over and over again on one point. The tin had not been swollen or distended, and the lobster had appeared to her to be in perfectly good condition. Raymond tapped his fingers against the armrest. So, no way to confirm botulism. Exactly. That left us with only the hard facts. If Jones had, in fact, administered arsenic to his wife, he could not have done so through the supper itself. 3 people had eaten the same meal. And then there was another point that made the case even more perplexing. He paused, glancing around the room before delivering the next revelation. Mr. Jones had only just returned from Birmingham at the moment supper was being served. He had no opportunity to tamper with the food beforehand. Joyce's brow furrowed. Then how in the world? That, Sir Henry interjected smoothly, was precisely our dilemma. A silence hung in the air as the weight of the mystery settled upon them. "Well," said Joyce at last, "if Jones was innocent, that leaves the only other person at the table." "Miss Clark," Sir Henry confirmed with a nod. "The stout woman with the good-humored face?" Joyce asked skeptically. "Indeed. We did not neglect to investigate Miss Clark, I can assure you. But there was a problem. She had no apparent motive. Mrs. Jones had left her nothing in her will. No inheritance, no bequests, nothing at all." Raymond frowned. "So what was her incentive?" "That, my dear Raymond," Sir Henry said, steepling his fingers, "was the question we had to answer." The room was deathly silent, the flickering candle casting eerie shadows on the walls. Sir Henry leaned forward, his voice dropping to a hushed tone. "One of my inspectors uncovered a rather significant fact," he said, pausing for effect. The listeners sat up straighter, their anticipation mounting. That night, after supper, Mr. Jones had descended the creaky staircase to the dimly lit kitchen. His presence startled young Gladys Lynch, the maid, who had been tidying up. He demanded a bowl of cornflour for his wife, his tone laced with an urgency that, in hindsight, was unsettling. "She's feeling unwell. Make it quick," he had said. Gladys had worked swiftly, the soft scraping of the spoon against the bowl the only sound filling the quiet kitchen. Mr. Jones stood over her, waiting. Once the bowl was prepared, he took it upstairs himself. Not a drop had been spilled. Not a moment had been wasted. The lawyer, sitting across from Sir Henry, exhaled sharply. "Motive?" he muttered, tapping his fingers against the table. "Opportunity. And as a traveler for a firm of druggists, he had easy access to poison." Raymond West narrowed his eyes. Something was amiss. "Then why wasn't he arrested?" he asked, his voice edged with suspicion. Sir Henry let out a slow, deliberate sigh before delivering the unexpected blow. "Because, dear friends, the entire bowl of cornflour was not drunk by Mrs. Jones at all." The tension in the room spiked. "It was Miss Clark who drank it." Gasps erupted. Eyes widened. The pieces of the puzzle had been thrown into disarray. Miss Clark, the stout, cheerful companion with no apparent motive. The woman who had everything to lose from Mrs. Jones' death and nothing to gain. "But why?" Joyce whispered, her fingers clenched around the armrest of her chair. Sir Henry nodded grimly. Miss Clark followed her usual routine that night and went to Mrs. Jones's room. She found her employer propped up in bed, pale and miserable. Beside her sat the untouched bowl of cornflour. "I'm not feeling a bit well, Millie," Mrs. Jones had murmured. "Serves me right for touching lobster at night. I asked Albert to get me a bowl of cornflour, but now that I have it, I don't seem to fancy it." The listeners held their breath as Sir Henry continued. Miss Clark, ever practical, had chuckled. "A pity," she had said, picking up the bowl. "It's nicely made, too. No lumps. Gladys is really quite a good cook." And then, in that one fatal moment, she had lifted the bowl to her lips and drank every last drop. A hush fell over the room. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. Sir Henry's voice was low, measured, as if every word carried the weight of a secret long buried. And just like that, the case fell apart. The listeners stirred, exchanging glances. There was something unnerving about how swiftly what seemed like an ironclad case had crumbled to dust. Miss Clark had drained the entire bowl of cornflour, leaving no trace for Mrs. Jones to consume. Whatever poison was suspected, it hadn't been in that bowl. And with that, the accusation against Mr. Jones collapsed. But what about the words found on the blotting pad? Joyce pressed, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. Sir Henry allowed himself a thin smile. Jones had an explanation for that, and a rather convenient one at that, he said, pausing for effect. The letter, according to Jones, was addressed to his brother in Australia. The brother had written, pleading for financial help. Jones, in response, had written that he was entirely dependent on his wife, and that, when she was dead, he would have control over money and might be able to assist if possible. The words hundreds and thousands had merely been a reference to the countless people suffering from financial difficulties worldwide. A perfectly reasonable explanation. Too reasonable. And so, Sir Henry continued, with no hard evidence, no clear method of poisoning, and a reasonable alibi, we could not take the risk of arresting Mr. Jones. The weight of the words settled over the room. "And that is all?" Joyce asked, her voice quiet, almost disbelieving. Sir Henry nodded. "That is how the case has stood for the last year." A heavy silence followed, stretching across the room. The only sound was the soft ticking of a clock. Then, Sir Henry's gaze sharpened. "However," he said slowly, "the true solution is now in the hands of Scotland Yard." The words sent a shiver through the listeners. "And in 2 or 3 days' time, you will probably read of it in the newspapers." A final puzzle. Joyce leaned back, tapping her fingers against the armrest of her chair. "The true solution," she murmured. "I wonder." She straightened. "Let's all take 5 minutes to think before we speak." The tension in the room crackled. Each person withdrew into their thoughts, the unsolved mystery looming over them like a storm cloud. Raymond West glanced at his watch. 5 minutes are up," he announced. His gaze fell on Dr. Pender. "Will you speak first?" The old man exhaled, shaking his head. His voice, when he spoke, was tinged with frustration. "I confess, I am utterly baffled," he admitted. "I cannot shake the feeling that the husband must be the guilty party, but how he did it, I cannot imagine." He sighed. "If the poison was truly administered, then how has it remained undiscovered for all this time?" A deeper question hung in the air, unspoken but heavy. Had they all missed something? The truth beneath the lies. The fire flickered, its glow casting eerie shadows that danced across the dimly lit room. The air was thick with the weight of unsolved mystery, the kind that crawls under your skin and refuses to let go. Joyce sat forward, her eyes gleaming with sharp determination. "The companion," she said decidedly. "Miss Clark. It was her, every time." A murmur ran through the group. "Why are we so quick to dismiss her?" Joyce continued, her voice rising slightly. Just because she was old, stout, and let's be honest, not exactly beautiful, that doesn't mean she wasn't capable of passion or hatred. She leaned in, her words cutting through the silence. Think about it being a companion, always having to smile, to agree, to nod politely while your own desires, your own anger is bottled up inside. One day, it becomes too much. The resentment builds, the patience wears thin, and then she snaps. A hush fell over the room. She hated Mrs. Jones. Joyce pressed on. Maybe she was in love with Jones himself. Maybe she loathed the wife for some other reason. But that night, she decided she couldn't bear it anymore. And so she killed her. The words hung in the air like smoke, curling around each listener, forcing them to consider the chilling possibility. And all that talk about drinking the poisoned cornflower herself, Joyce scoffed. A lie, a perfect calculated lie. A different perspective. The lawyer, Mr. Penderick, steepled his fingers together, a thoughtful expression settling over his face. On the face of it, there is nothing to disprove your theory, he admitted, his voice slow and deliberate. However, legally speaking, we must consider all angles before reaching a conclusion. Joyce gave a frustrated sigh. Oh, come now, Mr. Penderick. You can't sit on the fence with your legal jargon. You have to take a side, you have to play the game. A ghost of a smile flickered on the lawyer's lips. If I must commit to an opinion, he said, adjusting his glasses, then my instincts tell me this: the husband is guilty. Another murmur of interest rippled through the group. Consider this, Penderick continued. Miss Clark's story might not have been a lie, but rather a deliberate attempt to shield Mr. Jones. A heavy pause. She knew he would be suspected. Perhaps she even knew the truth. But what if she had something to gain? Joyce's brow furrowed. Go on. A financial arrangement. The lawyer's voice was firm. Mr. Jones had everything to lose, but Miss Clark, she saw only a bleak future of financial struggle. What if he promised her a reward? A sum of money in exchange for her silence, a future secured in return for a simple lie. The room felt colder somehow. If that was the case, Penderick added grimly, it was, of course, highly irregular. Most irregular indeed. The unraveling of secrets. A soft clinking noise broke the tension. Miss Marple had dropped a stitch in her knitting, her hand slightly trembling as she picked it back up. Dear, dear, she murmured. Such an interesting story. A sad case, a very sad case. She shook her head as if recalling a long-buried memory. It reminds me, she mused, of old Mr. Hargraves up at the Mount. His wife never suspected a thing, not a single thing, until he died, of course. She glanced up, her eyes sharp despite her gentle tone. And then the truth came out. The listeners leaned in, drawn into the quiet suspense of her words. He left all his money to another woman, Miss Marple continued, a woman he had secretly been living with for years, a woman who had given him 5 children. And who was she? She paused, letting the question hang in the air. At one time, she had been their housemaid. The silence that followed was deafening. Such a nice girl, Mrs. Hargraves always said. Miss Marple sighed, returning to her knitting, thoroughly to be relied upon. A shiver ran through the room. Some secrets, it seemed, stayed hidden until it was far too late. The final revelation. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the heavy silence that followed Miss Marple's words. Raymond West shifted impatiently in his chair, his brows furrowing. Aunt Jane, really, he said, exasperated. What on earth does old, dead, and gone Hargraves have to do with this case? Miss Marple looked up serenely from her knitting, her needles clicking together in quiet rhythm. Oh, but the similarities are striking, dear, she said, her voice as mild as ever. So very alike, don't you think? The deception, the secrets, the facade of innocence. She sighed, shaking her head. I suppose the poor girl has confessed by now. The room stilled. Sir Henry raised an eyebrow. What girl? Miss Marple blinked at him, surprised. Why, Gladys Lynch, of course, the kitchen maid. The one who was so terribly agitated when the doctor questioned her. And well she might be, poor thing. A few puzzled glances were exchanged. Poor thing, Joyce echoed. She poisoned a woman, Miss Marple. Miss Marple pursed her lips. Oh, I'm sure she never intended to. That wicked Mr. Jones, she's the one to blame. Manipulating that poor girl, making her unwittingly do his dirty work. I hope he's hanged for it. She shook her head, her voice tinged with sorrow. And I suppose they will hang her too, she murmured. Poor foolish girl. Mr. Penderick cleared his throat. Miss Marple, I believe you are under a slight misapprehension. But Miss Marple merely patted her knitting and turned her gaze to Sir Henry. I am right, am I not? She asked. It seems so clear to me. The hundreds and thousands, and the trifle. One cannot miss it. The what? Raymond demanded. What do you mean, the hundreds and thousands? Miss Marple sighed. Cooks nearly always put hundreds and thousands on trifle, dear. She explained patiently. Those little pink and white sugar sprinkles. She turned to Sir Henry again. When I heard that they had trifle for supper and that Mr. Jones had been writing to someone about hundreds and thousands, well, naturally, I connected the two things. That's where the arsenic was, in the sprinkles. The revelation struck like a thunderbolt. Good Lord, muttered Raymond. Sir Henry sat forward, his face sharp with intrigue. And you believe, he said slowly, that Jones left the poisoned sprinkles with Gladys and instructed her to use them on the trifle. Of course, Miss Marple said briskly. But you see, dear, not everyone actually ate the trifle. A hush fell over the room. But they all ate it, Joyce protested. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Oh no, my dear, she said gently. Not quite. The companion, Miss Clark, was banting, remember. She wouldn't touch anything as rich as trifle. A slow, chilling realization dawned. And Mr. Jones? Raymond asked hoarsely. Miss Marple gave a tiny, knowing smile. I expect he merely scraped the sprinkles off. A collective shudder rippled through the group. Jones had planned it meticulously. He knew his wife would eat the trifle. He knew Miss Clark, obsessed with her diet, would not. And he had manipulated poor, unsuspecting Gladys into playing her part without even knowing it. The final twist. The fire had burned low in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. The weight of Miss Marple's words hung heavy in the silence. Every eye was fixed upon Sir Henry, waiting for confirmation, for the final unmasking of the villain. He exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest of his chair. It is a very curious thing, he said. His voice measured, deliberate. But Miss Marple once again has hit upon the truth. A stunned hush fell over the gathering. Even Raymond West, usually skeptical of his aunt's deductions, sat back in his chair, momentarily lost for words. Jones, Sir Henry continued, his voice dropping to a grim tone, had gotten Gladys Lynch into trouble, as the saying goes. The girl was desperate, alone, helpless. He took advantage of her situation, lured her in with false promises, and when the time came, he made her his pawn in a cruel and calculated game. Joyce let out a quiet gasp, covering her mouth. He told her he would marry her, Sir Henry went on, his gaze dark, that as soon as his wife was out of the way, they could be together. But he needed her help. Just one small thing, just a sprinkle of harmless sugar decorations on a bowl of trifle. Miss Marple nodded, her expression tinged with sadness. The poor girl had no idea, she murmured. No idea at all what she was doing. Raymond leaned forward, still trying to grasp it. But how do you know this? If there was no evidence at the time. Sir Henry's face was grim. Because Gladys Lynch is dead. The words sent a chill through the room. She died a week ago, he continued. Her child was stillborn, and in the final hours of her life, abandoned, broken, and betrayed, she told the truth. Jones had deserted her for another woman. He had never intended to keep his word. A sharp intake of breath from Joyce. The bastard. Indeed, Sir Henry agreed. He fed her lies, used her as a tool, and then cast her aside. The clock ticked loudly in the silence, the weight of it all, the cruel deception, the manipulation, the utter disregard for a young woman's life settled heavily on everyone's shoulders. And so the case is finally closed, murmured Dr. Pender. Raymond turned to his aunt, shaking his head in disbelief. Well, Aunt Jane, This is one up to you. I can't think how on earth you managed to hit upon the truth. I would never have thought of the little maid in the kitchen being connected with the case." Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. She set down her knitting, smoothing out the wool with careful precision. "No, dear," she said gently. "But you don't know as much of life as I do. A man like that, coarse, jovial, charming in a way, he wouldn't have left a pretty young girl like Gladys alone. These things happen far too often, I'm afraid." Her smile faded, replaced by something sadder, something deeply understanding. "It is all very distressing and painful," she added, "and not a very nice thing to talk about. But such things happen in quiet villages, just as they do in the grandest of cities. People deceive, people betray, and the innocent suffer for it." She let out a quiet sigh. "I can't tell you the shock it was to poor Mrs. Hargraves. Such a scandal. A 9-day wonder in the village, no doubt." Her knitting needles clicked together once more, as if drawing a final, quiet line beneath the terrible tale. The fire crackled, the clock ticked on, and the room, once filled with idle conversation and lively debate, was now steeped in the weight of an undeniable tragic truth.